The morning sun streamed through the wide windows of the family dining room at Grant House, casting a warm glow of squares over the table, set with an assortment of pastries, fruit, and steaming pots of tea. The air was alive with conversation as Harriet's sisters, Jane and Eleanor, had arrived earlier that day along with their husbands. For Harriet, the familial gathering was a predictable mix of pleasantries and veiled scrutiny, a blend she navigated with quiet endurance and awkwardness. Jane, seated at her mother's right, had already voiced her thoughts on Harriet's recent meeting with Mr. Crawford. "You obviously must have done something to put him off, Harriet," Jane said, her tone filled with displeasure. "I've heard of Mr. Crawford. He is an amiable man of the village. I truly wonder why he even considered—" Her husband, Mr. Aldridge, shifted uncomfortably and interrupted. "The gentleman's lack of connection doesn't reflect poorly on Harriet, of course." Jane threw a testy glance to him. "I simply don't understand, Harriet. You had an opportunity and yet—" Agnes trailed off, her disappointment palpable, a mix of disgruntled sounds and woes. Eleanor, by contrast, leaned forward with a more sympathetic expression. "What exactly did he say to you, Harriet?" "I am sure it wasn't as terrible as it seems." Harriet's father sat up from his worn chair and spoke up, his voice steady but kind. "Let's not badger her. It's not a crime for two people not to suit." Harriet, grateful for the defense of few but uncomfortable with being the focus of conversation, quietly sipped her tea and looked out into the garden. Harriet let the conversation flow around her like a distant current. Her thoughts drifted inward. She focused on the warm porcelain cup in her hands, her mind spiraling into quiet reflections. As she lifted her teacup to her lips, she stole a glance at Eleanor, whose gentle eyes offered a faint but reassuring calm. Harriet let out a soft breath. "If I didn't do enough, perhaps it's because I don't understand what enough looks like to them. Or maybe—" She thought, a needle of discomfort prickling in her chest. "Maybe what I have to give isn't what anyone is looking for." After brunch, the men retreated to the study to discuss estate matters and partake in a round of billiards, leaving the women in the drawing room. Harriet settled near the window with her notebook, her fingers tracing its notes as she rambled on about a new species of butterfly she had spotted in the garden. Seated beside Harriet, Eleanor listened with sincerity and eventually leaned closer, placing a gentle hand on hers. "Harriet," Eleanor interrupted softly, "you've spoken at length about butterflies, but may I ask you something more important?" Harriet tilted her head slightly. "Of course. But what could be more important than butterflies, she thought. "Why do you think Mr. Crawford declined you? I just wish to know more." Harriet hesitated as she closed the leathery notebook between her palms and onto her lap. "He said we weren't suited, that we didn't speak the same language. I thought the meeting went well, but perhaps I misunderstood." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thoughtful line. "I see. Shall we take a turn in the garden? Some fresh air will surely lift spirits." Harriet brightened at the suggestion, and the two sisters made their way outside, the spring air filling Harriet with a sense of ease. As they strolled along the garden paths, Harriet explained in halting words her qualms regarding Mr. Crawford's remarks. "I thought I answered his questions clearly," Harriet explained, "but he seemed confused, or perhaps put off by my interests. I fear his humour was quite lost on me as well, and I cannot help but wonder if that is why he found me so unsuitable." Eleanor nodded slowly, squinting in thought. Her gaze softened towards the sun's peaking glow between the trees. "It sounds as though he simply didn't appreciate you for who you are, Harriet, and that isn't your fault." Harriet glanced at her sister in awe of her understanding tone. "You mean it wasn't because I am simply foolish?" Eleanor chuckled. "Not at all, Harriet. You are no fool. You're unique. And maybe Mr. Crawford wasn't the right sort to see the value in that." Harriet felt relief at her sister's kind words. Eleanor had assured her that Mr. Crawford's rejection was not a reflection of her existence, but rather a sign of their incompatibility. Yet, as Harriet's gaze drifted to the garden's ivy-clad walls, A grim concern arose. What if there is no one who finds me compatible? Their conversation was suddenly interrupted by the sound of stomping hooves approaching the house. Harriet and Eleanor turned the corner to find a rider dismounting from his horse near the front gate. A bright, handsome man with chestnut hair and an easy manner handed the reins to a waiting stable hand. He tugged at his cuffs and coat, dusting the pollen off his shoulders. "Goodness, is that—" Eleanor began, her voice trailing off. "Mr. Wickham?" Harriet finished, her eyes widening. It had been years since Edward Wickham had last visited the Grant house, but Harriet recognised him immediately. His boyish features had matured, his once lanky frame now grown and strong. He carried himself with the ease of a gentleman as he approached the house, his expression bright with familiarity. Inside, the family had already gathered at the doorway to greet him, their delight evident. Agnes exclaimed over how much he had grown, while Francis shook his hand with genuine warmth. When Harriet and Eleanor finally returned to the house, Edward turned toward them, his face lighting up with recognition. "Ah, Harriet," he said, stepping forward. "I wondered if you'd be here. It's been far too long." As Harriet approached the front steps, her eyes met Edward's, and she offered a tentative smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Wickham. It has been many years." Edward chuckled softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Mr. Wickham? Harriet? Surely you haven't grown so formal with an old friend?" She froze, momentarily caught off guard. "I thought it only proper." "Proper?" he interrupted, his tone light. "Since when did we stand on ceremony? Call me Edward, as you always did." A faint blush rose to Harriet's cheeks, but she nodded. "Very well, Edward. Welcome back." His smile widened. "That's better. It's good to see you again, Harriet." As they spoke, the afternoon folded into the evening. The Grant house was filled with gossip, tales and endless chatter. Edward's gaze lingered on Harriet, his tone comforting and familiar. "Well, how have you been, Harriet? Are you keeping busy with your studies of— what was it? Botany, correct?" Harriet's smile grew. "Botany and ornithology, yes. I still keep my notebooks." Edward smiled with satisfaction. "I remember you filling pages with sketches of plants when we were children. It's good to see some things don't change." The conversation naturally turned to Edward's return to the village and his memories of the time he had spent at Grant House as a boy. Leaning comfortably back in his chair, Edward grinned at Harriet, his gaze brimming with mischief. "I still remember the time Harriet and I decided to rescue the rose bushes from the tyranny of aphids," Edward began, his voice rich with nostalgia. "We armed ourselves with watering cans and buckets, fully convinced that drowning the poor creatures was the only solution." Eleanor, seated by the fire, raised her quizzical brow. "Rescue the roses? That sounds rather noble for a pair of children." She grinned. "Noble, perhaps," Edward replied, laughing, but completely misguided. "We emptied so much water onto the poor plants that half the blooms were drooping by the next morning. Harriet, of course, insisted we'd done everything perfectly." "I had read about the importance of proper hydration," Harriet interjected earnestly, her cheeks tinged pink. "I simply miscalculated the application." Edward laughed in between his sips of tea. "That's putting it kindly. And let's not forget the aftermath. Mrs. Bates was quite overcome when she saw the state of the garden." Jane leaned in, her eyes dancing with amusement. "Surely you weren't scolded too harshly, Mr. Wickham?" Edward smirked. "Oh, Harriet saved us both. She marched up to Mrs. Bates, book in hand, and declared, 'Science requires experimentation.'" I don't think the poor woman knew what to say. The room erupted into laughter. Even Agnes, who often found Harriet's childhood antics tiresome, couldn't help but smile. "It sounds as though you two made quite the team," chuckled Eleanor. Edward looked towards Harriet. "We did. Harriet was always the mastermind, and I was happy to follow along no matter how absurd the plan seemed." Harriet lowered her gaze, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Agnes sighed with a fondness that softened her usual sternness. She was always a peculiar child. It's a wonder she didn't get herself into more trouble. Harriet, though quieter than usual, felt a rare lightness in her chest. Edward's words seemed to wrap around her like a blanket, comfortable, kind, and wholly unexpected. Agnes clapped her hands together joyously. "Mr. Wickham, you must stay for dinner. It's been far too long since we've had you here, hasn't it, Mr. Grant?" Francis looked up from his book, startled but pleased. "Indeed, Mr. Wickham, you must join us. It's not often we're graced with such pleasant surprises, and I dare say we've plenty to catch up on." "I'd be honoured," Edward replied, inclining his head. "Though I must admit, I came by on business. I'll be in the area only for the summer, settling some matters in Cheltenham." "That's marvellous," Francis said. "We'll expect to see much more of you while you're here then." As the family settled into new conversations, Harriet found herself stealing glances at Edward. His presence brought a sense of comfort, as if an old, familiar piece of her life had fallen back into place, and Harriet adored the familiar. As Jane and Eleanor's carriages rolled away into the fading light, Harriet stood at the doorway alongside her waving parents. She watched as Jane waved from the window of the first carriage, Eleanor offering her a warm smile from the second. Edward lingered by his horse for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze drifting briefly back toward the house. Agnes, ever mindful of opportunities, nudged Harriet forward with a pointed look. "Harriet, perhaps you might thank Mr. Wickham for his visit. It's been such a pleasure to have him here again, has it not?" Harriet was startled. "Yes, of course," she stuttered, her eyes meeting Edward's, but not quite. "It was pleasant to see you again, Mr. Wickham." Edward's lips twitched with a restrained smile as he stepped forward. "Edward will do, Harriet. I told you that already." "Yes, Edward," she corrected herself, her cheeks warming in forgetful embarrassment. "I'm glad you stopped by, truly." Agnes raised her eyebrows, clearly expecting more, but Harriet shifted her weight and fell silent. For all her effort, words still felt like an ill-fitting coat, too stiff and awkward to wear comfortably. Edward, sensing her discomfort, didn't press. Instead, he gave a slight bow. "Thank you, Harriet. It's good to be back." With that, he turned and mounted his horse, his movements practiced and smooth. As he adjusted the reins, he cast one last glance toward the house, his gaze lingering briefly. As he rode off, Agnes huffed, her tone helpless. "Oh, Harriet, you could have said more." Harriet glanced at her mother, bewildered, then back at the fading silhouette of Edward, shrinking into the distance. She tilted her head. "I believe I said enough." Unbeknownst to Harriet nor Agnes, Edward thought so too.